You've probably heard the word indigo used so casually that it starts to sound like just another spiritual label, another identity people collect to feel unique. Another category added beside empath, old soul, or light worker. But long before modern spirituality turned inner sensitivity into a trend, Carl Jung was documenting something far more complex and far more unsettling. He observed a rare psychological configuration that did not simply make a person emotional or intuitive. It shaped the entire structure of their consciousness. Individuals with this configuration didn't struggle to fit in because they wanted attention or rebellion. They struggled because their perception operated in a way that made ordinary social reality feel fundamentally artificial. Jung never used the term indigo empath himself. That language emerged decades later. Yet the pattern he described, a constellation of penetrating awareness, emotional intensity, and relentless authenticity, aligns almost perfectly with what we now recognize by that name. These were not merely sensitive people reacting strongly to life. They were individuals whose inner architecture functioned on a different psychological frequency. That difference created a life experience marked by deep isolation, misunderstood reactions, and a persistent feeling of being fundamentally misaligned with the systems surrounding them. Many spent years believing something inside them was broken. In truth, Jung found the opposite. What disturbed him was not weakness in these individuals, but the disruptive clarity they carried. They possessed an almost instinctive intolerance for denial. Wherever they went, they seemed to expose what others were unconsciously trying to avoid, not through confrontation or intention, but simply through the nature of their presence. Their awareness illuminated contradictions in families, institutions, and relationships, without them actively trying to reveal anything. Jung described this as a psychological force that both fascinated and troubled him because it suggested a developmental pathway that did not follow conventional timelines of emotional or social adaptation. Today, we will explore 7 specific signs Jung associated with this rare configuration. Each sign carries both remarkable potential and significant psychological difficulty. Together, they form a pattern that explains why some individuals experience life not as a gradual adjustment to social norms, but as a continuous negotiation between inner truth and external expectation. The first sign appears very early. Jung referred to it as an involuntary rejection of false authority. For the indigo empath, resistance to certain authority figures is not rooted in defiance or immaturity. It arises from a deep intuitive recognition when power is being exercised without genuine psychological integrity. This response often begins in childhood, long before the individual has the language to explain what they are sensing. Consider the child who refuses to comply with a teacher's instruction, not out of stubbornness, but because something in them detects insecurity masked as control. They cannot articulate this perception. They only experience a visceral sense that respect is being demanded rather than naturally earned. Adults typically interpret this reaction as behavioral difficulty. Jung saw it differently. He recognized it as discernment emerging before conscious reasoning could support it. For the indigo empath, submission to authority is not simply a social expectation. It is filtered through an internal system that constantly evaluates authenticity. When that system perceives falseness, compliance becomes psychologically impossible. This response is not chosen, it is wired. And as these individuals grow older, the same pattern follows them into workplaces, institutions, and social hierarchies, environments that often rely on unquestioned performance rather than genuine alignment. This early resistance to false authority rarely disappears with maturity. Instead, it evolves into a more refined but equally uncompromising sensitivity to structures built on appearances, rather than substance. As indigo empaths enter adolescence and adulthood, they often discover that many social systems function through roles people unconsciously agree to perform. Corporate hierarchies, institutional traditions, and even spiritual communities can feel suffocating to them, not because they reject structure itself, but because they instinctively perceive when authority is maintained through fear, image, or inherited status rather than genuine competence or inner coherence. Jung observed that this pattern often resulted in repeated cycles of conflict and withdrawal. Indigo empaths might initially engage with enthusiasm, hoping to contribute something meaningful, only to experience a growing sense of inner tension as their perception reveals inconsistencies beneath the surface. What appears stable or legitimate to others can feel psychologically dissonant to them. This dissonance is not intellectual disagreement. It is somatic, almost neurological, a bodily refusal to align with what their awareness interprets as inauthentic. Over time, many learn to mask this reaction, but the effort required to maintain that mask can lead to exhaustion or quiet despair. The second sign Jung described is an existential awareness, emerging at an unusually young age. Most children move through early life absorbed in immediate experiences, friendships, games, small triumphs and disappointments. Their consciousness is oriented toward the present moment, protected by a developmental innocence that allows them to explore the world without confronting its deeper uncertainties. Indigo empaths, however, often report memories of questioning existence itself long before such questions are typically formed. They may recall lying awake as young children, wondering why life exists at all, sensing the inevitability of death without being taught about it, or feeling unsettled by the unspoken assumptions governing adult behavior. These reflections are not simply signs of precocious intelligence. Jung interpreted them as early contact with layers of the psyche that most individuals do not consciously encounter until midlife, if ever. He connected this phenomenon to what he termed the premature activation of the collective unconscious, a state in which archetypal themes of meaning, mortality, and purpose become experientially accessible before the ego has developed sufficient stability to contextualize them. This creates a profound developmental paradox. While their inner world expands into existential depth, their external environment continues to treat them as ordinary children expected to conform to routine expectations. Homework, social popularity, and surface achievements can feel strangely trivial when contrasted with the magnitude of the questions already forming within them. The resulting disconnect may foster a quiet sense of alienation that persists long after childhood ends. The third sign involves an emotional intensity that extends beyond conventional empathic sensitivity. All empaths experience heightened responsiveness to emotional atmospheres. Indigo empaths, however, often describe their feelings as immersive, multi-layered experiences that seem to contain symbolic or collective dimensions. Jung suggested that their emotional perception is intertwined with archetypal awareness, allowing them to encounter personal feelings as gateways into broader psychological realities. When they encounter grief, for instance, the sensation may carry an inexplicable depth, as though touching an ancient reservoir of human sorrow, rather than merely reacting to a specific event. Joy may arrive with an equally complex texture, accompanied by a sense of recognition, as if rediscovering something fundamental rather than experiencing a fleeting pleasure. Such emotional states can be difficult to articulate because everyday language is designed for narrower ranges of feeling. In clinical settings, this intensity has often been misinterpreted as instability. Jung cautioned against reducing such experiences to pathology without examining their qualitative richness. He noted that emotional perception operating at this level can resemble dysregulation from an external viewpoint. Yet internally, It may represent an expanded sensitivity to symbolic meaning and relational nuance. The challenge lies not in the presence of these feelings, but in the absence of cultural frameworks capable of validating or integrating them. As a result, indigo empaths frequently learn to compress their emotional expression. They become adept at presenting a moderated version of their inner reality, revealing only fragments that appear socially acceptable. This adaptive strategy allows them to function within environments that might otherwise overwhelm them, but it also generates internal pressure. Over years or decades, the disparity between lived experience and outward performance can lead to moments of psychological rupture, either through breakdown, when the system can no longer sustain suppression, or breakthrough, when deeper authenticity begins to emerge despite external resistance. Jung regarded this tension as a critical turning point in individuation. The very sensitivity that once produced isolation can become a source of insight and creative transformation when consciously acknowledged. Without such acknowledgement, however, it may manifest as chronic fatigue, identity confusion, or a persistent feeling of being misunderstood at a fundamental level. The fourth sign builds upon this emotional and existential awareness, extending it into the perception of systemic patterns. Indigo empaths often report an uncanny ability to sense the invisible dynamics shaping groups, organizations, or entire cultural contexts. Rather than focusing solely on individual interactions, they intuitively grasp the underlying architecture that organizes collective behavior. They notice unspoken agreements, subtle power exchanges, and recurring cycles of dysfunction long before others recognize them. Jung distinguished this capacity from ordinary empathic attunement. While many sensitive individuals can feel the emotional state of another person, indigo empaths appear to perceive how those emotional states interlock within larger structures. Entering a new environment, they may quickly understand who holds influence, where tension is suppressed, and how collective narratives maintain stability even when those narratives contradict lived reality. This perception can make them invaluable catalysts for change in systems that genuinely seek growth. Yet, in environments invested in preserving appearances, it can render them unintentionally threatening. Consequently, their lives often involve repeated transitions. Jobs, friendships, communities, and even belief systems may feel temporary, because each new context eventually reveals patterns they cannot ignore. Their role becomes that of the person who names what others sense but prefer not to articulate, not out of a desire to disrupt, but because their awareness resists the psychological comfort of selective blindness. This heightened perception of systemic dynamics gradually leads to the fifth sign Jung associated with this configuration: a profound and often painful inability to perform inauthenticity. Most people learn early that social belonging requires a degree of performance. They develop subtle skills for smoothing tension, offering polite agreement, or participating in conversations that hold little personal meaning. These adaptations are rarely experienced as deception. Instead, they function as practical tools that allow complex societies to operate with relative harmony. For the indigo empath, however, sustaining such performances can feel psychologically constricting. They often understand social roles with exceptional clarity. They can observe how humor diffuses discomfort, how politeness preserves hierarchy, and how shared assumptions maintain group cohesion. Yet when it comes to adopting these roles themselves, something in their inner structure resists with surprising intensity. Jung likened this resistance to a sensation of suffocation, not metaphorical, but deeply felt within the psyche. The longer they attempt to maintain a persona that contradicts their authentic perception, the more internal tension accumulates. This tension may manifest as fatigue, irritability, or an unexplainable urge to withdraw. What appears from the outside as social awkwardness or unpredictability is in many cases a direct response to the strain of sustaining incongruence between inner awareness and outward behavior. Jung interpreted this pattern as evidence of individuation processes activating earlier than usual. Individuation, in his framework, is the gradual movement toward psychological wholeness, the integration of conscious identity with deeper layers of the self. Most individuals begin this process during midlife transitions, when established roles no longer provide sufficient meaning. Indigo empaths, by contrast, often experience its pressures from childhood onward. Their psyche seems oriented toward authenticity long before they possess the emotional or social resources to live in alignment with it. This creates a distinctive form of loneliness. They are surrounded by people who function comfortably within shared performances, while they struggle to participate without feeling fragmented. The sixth sign Jung described emerges from this early individuation, what he termed the wound of premature knowing. Indigo empaths frequently perceive truths about relationships, authority structures, and human motivation, long before they have the developmental context to understand what they are seeing. A child might intuit that parental affection is complicated by unspoken resentment, or that institutional rules are maintained more by fear than by genuine conviction. Such insights arrive not as suspicions but as vivid impressions that feel undeniably real. Because these perceptions often contradict the narratives presented by adults, the young indigo empath may question their own sanity. They sense patterns others deny, yet lack the vocabulary to articulate them. This discrepancy can foster deep self-doubt. Jung found that many individuals carrying this configuration remembered feeling isolated by knowledge they could neither verify nor share. Their awareness matured faster than their capacity to integrate it, creating a psychological wound rooted in solitude. As they grow older, the pattern does not disappear. Instead, perception sharpens. What began as awareness of family dynamics expands into recognition of organizational politics, cultural contradictions, and collective myths shaping social reality. Each new layer of understanding reinforces the original sense of being out of step with the consensus around them. Without conscious reflection or supportive environments, this accumulation of insight can harden into cynicism. Some become disillusioned observers, convinced that authenticity is unattainable within existing systems. Others experience waves of existential heaviness, sensing the magnitude of what they perceive without knowing how to respond constructively. Jung emphasized that integration is essential to prevent such outcomes. The wound of premature knowing does not heal automatically with age. It requires deliberate inner work, the gradual development of emotional resilience and symbolic understanding capable of transforming raw perception into wisdom. When this process unfolds, the very awareness that once caused isolation can evolve into a stabilizing influence. Indigo empaths begin to recognize that insight alone is not their burden. Learning how to embody it with compassion becomes their task. This leads naturally to the seventh and most demanding sign, an enduring sense of mission that defies precise articulation. Indigo empaths often feel driven by an inner calling that extends beyond conventional ambitions. It is not simply a desire for career success or social recognition. Rather, it manifests as a persistent intuition that their heightened perception exists for a meaningful purpose. They may struggle to define this purpose, yet they cannot fully ignore its presence. Jung connected this experience to what he called vocation in its deepest psychological sense. Unlike occupational choice, vocation arises from the totality of the psyche, an internal directive urging the individual toward forms of expression aligned with their authentic nature. For indigo empaths, resisting this directive can produce profound discomfort. They may attempt to conform to expected life paths only to encounter repeated disruptions, loss of motivation, unexplained health challenges, or a pervasive sense of emptiness. These signals often indicate that their psyche is refusing to settle into roles that suppress essential aspects of their awareness. At the same time, Jung cautioned against misinterpreting this sense of mission as an obligation to rescue others. Indigo empaths who believe their purpose requires self-sacrifice frequently encounter burnout or emotional depletion. Their calling, he suggested, is less about transforming the external world through force and more about embodying authenticity within it. By living in alignment with their perception, they create spaces where genuine dialogue and psychological growth become possible. This orientation toward meaningful contribution can be both inspiring and exhausting. Indigo empaths often feel drawn to environments that promise depth and integrity. Yet, they may discover that such environments are rare or fragile. Their journey involves learning to sustain purpose without becoming consumed by the expectation of constant transformation. When they begin to balance insight with self-care, the mission that once felt overwhelming can evolve into a steady source of direction. When these 7 signs are viewed not as isolated traits, but as a unified pattern, a clearer picture begins to emerge. What many indigo empaths have interpreted as personal dysfunction is, in Jungian terms, a distinctive psychological configuration. It is a way of perceiving reality that brings both expanded awareness and significant developmental challenges. The lifelong sense of not fitting in, the emotional depth that others struggle to understand, the resistance to roles that feel hollow, all of these experiences begin to make sense when seen through this lens. Jung did not consider such individuals to be anomalies in a negative sense. He regarded them as carriers of a particular kind of consciousness that reveals hidden tensions within social structures. Their sensitivity is not merely about feeling more. It is about perceiving underlying dynamics that often remain invisible to the collective. This perception can disrupt comfort zones, yet it also creates opportunities for authenticity to emerge in places where performance has long been mistaken for truth. For those who recognize themselves in this description, the realization can be both relieving and confronting. Relief arises from understanding that the inner struggles they have carried are not signs of inadequacy. Confrontation follows because awareness brings responsibility. To see more deeply means to engage more consciously with one's own development. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming fully aligned with the self, represents one of the most demanding yet meaningful paths available to human beings. Indigo empaths often feel called toward this path earlier and more intensely than others. Accepting this orientation does not mean rejecting the world or withdrawing from relationships. Rather, it involves learning how to navigate reality without abandoning authenticity. It means recognizing that intensity can be guided into creativity, that systemic perception can support constructive change, and that early existential awareness can evolve into mature wisdom. The qualities that once created isolation can become sources of connection when integrated with empathy and grounded presence. At the same time, Jung cautioned against the temptation to force oneself into definitions of normality that negate inner truth. Conformity may offer temporary stability, but sustained denial of authentic perception can erode psychological vitality. For indigo empaths, well-being often depends on finding or creating environments where depth is welcomed rather than suppressed. This might involve unconventional career paths, intentional communities, or personal practices that foster reflection and symbolic understanding. Ultimately, the journey described here is not about adopting a label. It is about recognizing a pattern of awareness and choosing how to live in relationship with it. The world will continue to value efficiency, performance, and visible success. Yet, alongside these priorities, there remains a quiet need for individuals who can perceive what lies beneath appearances. Jung believed that every collective system benefits from such presence, not as a force of destruction, but as a reminder that genuine transformation begins with honest perception. If you see yourself reflected in these signs, the task ahead is not to diminish your sensitivity, but to develop it with discernment. The path of individuation asks for patience, courage, and a willingness to engage with inner complexity. On the other side of that engagement lies the possibility of a life shaped not by the pressure to belong, but by the deeper satisfaction of being fully, consciously yourself.